exactly does that mean? Well, so then you might say, well, what's the most poisonous thing that you could possibly face if you dramatize the idea of poison itself? If you wanted people to face what was worst so that they could become strongest? And the answer to that is the most unjust possible painful death and the ultimate confrontation with malevolence. And that's what's dramatized in the Passion story. Now, does that redeem everyone? Maybe. Maybe the idea is that if we were courageous enough to look death in the face unflinchingly, and if we spent our time putting our finger on the source of evil itself, it would revitalize ourselves to a degree that would be unimaginable. Now, as a biologist, you can think about this too, because
here we see Jordan Peterson in dialogue with Dawkins talking about the Christian narrative of the death and resurrection of Christ. And as he talks about it, he's talking about it from this metaphorical stance, where he's talking about, as a metaphor, this may be a story of profound insight because it's telling us to face things that we are engaged in a process of denying, to face our own death and to focus on the concept of evil. At face value, this seems like a plausible insight, but when we think about it and we break it apart and we analyze what's really going on here, the first thing we find out is that the Christian story isn't talking about any of this confrontation with death. It's the exact opposite, which was the point that was made by Ernest Becker in his book Denial of Death. Christianity is not a metaphor or an approach toward existence where humans are engaged in the process of facing reality. It's just the opposite. It's a process of denial where humans are engaged in trying to construct an immortality system so they can evade and escape the reality that they don't like, the reality that terrifies them. So Christianity is not an example of psychologically facing reality on its own terms. It's not an example of focusing in on what's actually evil and preventing us from developing and growing and progressing as a species. Its conception of evil is a scapegoated form of evil, is a projected form of evil, where it's trying to create and locate a concept of evil that it can persecute, that it can engage in a process of psychological splitting with, so that it can make itself feel better about the nature of reality. The other thing that's going on here that Peterson is not aware of, so he's giving this psychological interpretation of Christianity, wherein he's talking about exposure therapy right before this, and he's talking about how intelligent it is to confront these things that we're afraid of, and the importance of not engaging in a denial of death because that causes all kinds of problems. Now, while this is true, while it's accurate that it makes sense that we should face the reality that we are born into, that we become conscious in, what Peterson's not aware of here is that the consciousness that he is using to interpret this story of Christianity is itself derived from psychology. This is a very important point because Peterson thinks he's stumbled upon some great profound insight when in fact he's brought the insight to the story from the very beginning. He had it a priori to his interpretation of the story. He thinks that facing death, which is uncomfortable, and concentrating in on a concept of evil is valuable because his training in psychology, because that's what psychology has revealed to him. He did not get this from the Christian story. This is not what Christianity delivers over to him. This is what he brings to it or draws out of it based upon his own prior education in psychology. So he can then say, well, there's a metaphor here where we should confront death and then we should focus on this concept of evil. Now, the problem with this in Peterson's worldview is multi-layered. One of the problems with Peterson's idea of facing death is that I don't think he's able to do that, and the myths that he is engaging in, specifically Christianity, is an exercise, a psychological exercise, historically, of trying to evade that. It is an attempt of humans to subconsciously construct an immortality system to make themselves feel better about their own death. The second thing that's a problem is when Jordan Peterson says focus in on evil. In his worldview, this is a loaded term. Jordan Peterson does not have enough of an understanding of sociology, of an understanding of the progressiveness of the way society functions, and an understanding of the formation of human development as it is necessitated by interaction with the other, and how social environments can sabotage the quality of an individual's life. So when he says focus in on evil, and Jordan Peterson, he has in his psychology what we call a strong sense of closure. He's looking for very exact, certain type of narratives. And because of that, when he goes to define what evil is, this can become dangerous very, very fast. The Nazis defined evil as well. So if we think a bit of it in these terms, that where we're just going to focus in on death and then focus in on defining evil, well, the Nazis define evil as the Jews taking over the world, of an ethnic group, because they scapegoated it. If Peterson, in his psychology and his interpretation, is not aware of his own subconscious drives in this process, he can end up defining evil in a way that it's not broad enough, it's not aware enough, it's not civil enough, it's not humane enough. It's a definition of evil that is informed by his own moral bias or his own moralism. And that's a problem. That's significantly a problem, because if you construct a society like that, that is precisely what the Nazis tried to do. You don't solve your problem if you just try to simply define this psychological split notion of good and evil. You put everything onto the side of the evil category and just say, if we eliminate this, we're going to find ourselves in an enlightened, emancipated position, when in fact what you end up doing is destroying the species and sabotaging humanity, because you end up persecuting scapegoats within the context of society that make you feel better. They make you feel like you're making progress. They make you feel like you're conquering evil. But in reality, you are just persecuting other individuals that don't agree with your particular cultural values. So we see Peterson not being aware or conscious of what he's engaged in here by saying that the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, metaphorically, maybe this story is telling us that we should focus on death and then we should focus on evil. It's not broad enough. He doesn't have a broad enough comprehension of this to be able to wield it in such a way that he can actually bring a deeper understanding to the mythology. And I think that in his hands, it actually ends up being something that's very, very destructive. Again, he's also not aware of the fact that he's bringing his psychology to bear on this myth. And that what intelligence should tell him, he should realize, wait a second, I'm already using these axioms, these assumptions that tell me that it's good to confront things that are uncomfortable, that's psychologically healthy. Why don't I just stick with the reasoning that led me to these axioms, to these principles of psychological emancipation in the first place? Why am I going back to myth from an enlightened consciousness that is then interpreting this myth back to myself through my own enlightenment? In other words, the psychological position is superior, far superior to the myth that he's interpreting, because he cannot get his interpretation from the myth. He gets the exact opposite of his interpretation. What he gets from the myth is the denial of death, is pushing away that the ultimate meaning in life is to believe in some kind of supernatural realm, some type of eternal realm in the face of death so that we don't face death, and then to construct a shallow understanding of evil and then to pursue that within the context of society. That's what the mythological, the tyranny and the authoritarianism of the myth tells us. But if he was aware of what's going on there, he would understand that he already has a transcendent psychological structure from the very beginning. That's the position that's interpreting the myth beyond the capacity of the myth itself. And the question is, why do you even need the myth? Why don't you just get rid of the myth? Because this interpretation is not what people got from the myth of Christianity. What they get from it is a looking away from death. What Peterson brings in thousands of years later to Christianity and tries to pretend that this is some original interpretation that was embedded or contained within the theology is false. He's able to superimpose that back onto the theology because he is the student of an enlightened project of psychology, which has helped him to understand the value of confronting things like death that make us feel uncomfortable. And the last thing I will say is that, yes, there's a value to actually confronting our death and to trying to look at not evil, I would say, but at the impediments, the social impediments that get in the way of the development of humans within the context of society, the inequalities that sabotage the individual life. There is a value to this for sure, but this is not the message of the Gospels. This is not what we get from the mythology. We do not also get this from Jordan Peterson's interpretation. We get this as we think about it from a sociological vantage point combined dialectically with a psychological understanding.